Hello, everybody. We're working out our high-tech details. So in the meanwhile, I want to invite you to get started on a low-tech check-in. I'm going to pass around sticky notes, and I'd like everyone to take 3. The colors don't matter. And jot down your thoughts based on the homework or however much of it you were able to do. And there are 3 questions on the board back there. What was new or surprising? What was challenging to think about? And what resonated with your own experience? And hopefully by the time you're done jotting down notes about that and sticking them on one of these other boards that I will pull up, we'll have the tech figured out. So whenever you're ready with the 3 check-in reflection questions, just go ahead and stick them up on that other easel board. And of course, take a look at what other folks are writing. So when you're done reading the sticky notes, just make your way back to your seats, and we will, we're actually not gonna get into too much discussion about the homework right now. It will come in a lot of places, but we wanted to give you a chance to sort of get out your immediate reactions because some of the homework might have brought up a lot of reactions, a lot of feelings, a lot of resonance for people in different ways. I know you all know each other, and I know most of you, but some of you I don't know, and Jay hasn't met anyone. So we're gonna go into introductions in a moment, and Jay's gonna set that up for us with a little bit more content than our usual introductions. Oh no, now you're silent again. Okay. I'm pretty sure nothing changed over here. Yeah.
I guess we can go up and see if that helps.
No.
No.
That's not it.
Was it something with your phone? It seemed like you touched something and then magic.
My phone shouldn't be connected to it at all.
All right, you were just.
I'm messing with my settings also. Is that better? Okay, great. Hello.
Okay. Welcome.
All right. So I muted myself briefly, which apparently then reset to what it had been set to before. So that is what happened there. Anyway, hello, everyone. As Dave and I were chatting a little bit earlier, and most of you probably heard, I'm in the back as far as who I can see, so I can mostly see the backs of your heads. So hello. Thank you. So this may be new for some of you with having some in-person facilitation and some remote facilitation. This may be old hat for some of you. And we are going to be as transparent and direct as we can in what we're doing so that this feels good. So to move into kind of where we wanted to start, which in thinking about disability and thinking about access and what that looks like, we wanted to have a really focused check-in about access needs in this space, and also your relationships to kind of these 2 major systems or concepts that we're really diving into today around disability and around fatness. So as far as kind of the why of what we're asking, we really want to make sure that we're putting access in the foreground really meaningfully, rather than having it as an afterthought, which often happens in events. And as we're talking about disability justice and fat justice specifically, really putting access right at the center is going to be one of the ways that we can lift up what at least the steps towards liberation can be. We also want to focus on, again, access and not having to justify whys. A lot of the times in the ways that this gets framed, disabled folks have to explain in great detail body needs and diagnoses and other pieces that justify why they need what they need. And that is not necessary and is really dehumanizing and stigmatizing. And so we just want to put in the forefront, what do we all need to really be here present today? We also just want to normalize and name and validate these relationships, because even though disability is often visible and fatness is visible, relationships to these are often silenced or invisibilized when we start talking about it, because people get really uncomfortable in naming body difference, particularly stigmatized body difference. So we want to raise those up. Davy, was there anything you wanted to add to the framing?
No, that sounds good.
Okay. So Davy and I are going to do our introductions. And I will start with my name and my pronouns, and then we're both going to be talking a little bit about kind of our relationships to disability and fatness, and then also access needs in this space and how we're meeting some of those to demonstrate what we're going to be asking you to do. So my name is Jay Botsford. My pronouns are ze, zers, zers, or they, them, theirs. I am currently coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin. Hello. As I said, there are cats and dogs in this house that may be loud, hopefully not too loud, although as time goes on and she wants dinner more, one of them may stick her head under the door and start screaming. So I am a fat, disabled person. I do use identity first language. Without going into a whole lot of details, I do want to name that I have a number of chronic physical and mental illnesses. And so part of the ways that we're meeting some of those access needs that I do have is in the ways that we're structuring this meeting today. So, for example, part of the reason that we're doing this part remote or mobile and part in person is because if I travel, and particularly if I have a chemical exposure while traveling, I need significant recovery time. So to travel 5.5 hours and then try to get back to be able to go to work, my day job tomorrow, would not probably be possible. So given the amount of recovery time, if anything flared, if there was a chemical exposure while I was there, I may have to just take off the rest of the week, which is not an option for me this week. So I also wanted to name some other access pieces for me. You'll notice I'm wearing glasses. Although this is a pretty normalized access piece, this is absolutely essential for me to be able to actually see what I'm doing. We're using sound amplification, both because I'm remote and also I'm hard of hearing. This also, by being remote, allows me to be completely fragrance-free in my home and to have a space that is comfortable and supportive for my body around my physical needs as well. So that is kind of where I am coming from in this. And I also just want to name, as far as fatness goes, to translate the medical parlance, I am death fat. So disabled and death fat over here. I will pass that on to you, Davy.
Thank you, Jay. I'm Davy. I use any and all pronouns mixed together. I think most of you know, because I communicated access needs well in advance, I have a couple of disabling chronic illnesses, including one that makes me very neurologically reactive to fragrances. So the biggest access need that I have in this space is to have as little fragrance as possible. In this space, it's actually been not too hard, but part of the access steps that we've had to take to make it possible for me to be here include negotiating that with the B&B and all of that kind of stuff. So it's there's a lot of like logistics behind getting me here that are specific to that stuff. My relationship with disability communities is a little bit weird because I don't look disabled and because I am sometimes very disabled and sometimes not, kind of depending how my health is going that week, month, year. And that also has shifted like how I think about identity first language and person first language, because it at some times feels like more of a central identity than at other times. And that depends not only on how my body's doing, but like how my access setup is doing. I don't feel very disabled when I'm at home and my access setup is ideal. When I try to do things like travel, then I start to feel it in different ways. In terms of fatness, I've been pretty thin my entire adult life and have learned about the sort of power structures surrounding fatness and the sort of devaluing of fat bodies, mostly through friends who I've been in supportive relationships with, including like really close friends who I've lived with and like just witnessed the daily abuse that they get just for walking around in the bodies that they're in. And I've also encountered that, we often say like systems of oppression target some groups and privilege other groups, but they harm everyone, right? And one of the ways that the oppression of fat folks also harms thin folks is that I've had like totally inadequate medical care because I was losing weight and I saw that as like a sign that something was wrong. But doctors could not believe me because losing weight is like always obviously a good thing in their minds. And right now I think the heaviest I've ever been and definitely the healthiest, like by a lot. Because for like 10 years I couldn't convince a doctor that my weight loss was a problem. Access needs, in addition to the stuff I said, I need to move around and stretch sometimes, and I will just go ahead and do that whether or not we're during break time. And I need pretty limited exposure to fluorescence, and ever since the clock changed, it helps a lot to just keep some of the room dark, and that helps a lot too. I think that's pretty much it for my access stuff for today.
Great. So we're going to ask that y'all pair up and talk a little bit about your relationships with disability and with fatness and size, and also to kind of think through and name what your access needs are to be able to be as fully present and participatory in this space as you can be. So turn to someone near you, have that conversation. We're going to give you about 5 minutes. It's always good to hear a lot of engagement and talking about this. All right. So it sounds like there were fruitful discussions happening. You all sound like you're completely underwater to me unless you're speaking directly into a microphone, which is fascinating and an interesting part of being remote. So we do want to head around the room, and we're going to ask each of you to speak directly into a mic. And we'd like to invite you to state what your access needs are. So what is the things that you need from the room, from the space, from us as facilitators to be able to be as physically and mentally engaged, present, and comfortable in this space as possible. So I think Davey has the mic to go around.
Yep, I'll pass it around. And also say your names and pronouns.
Yes. I will take notes so that I remember everyone's name.
I get to cheat by reading the name tags.
See.
And actually, that's an access tool, isn't it? If we all had perfect memory, we wouldn't need name tags. That's an access tool for our imperfect memories. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. You ready to start?
Hi, I'm Pam, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I need to be able to get to a bathroom because, yeah, I drink a lot of water and then things happen. And I also get cold really, really easily. And when I get really cold, like when we did the workshop with you in May, it was so cold, I can't function.
Yeah.
So I need warmth.
Thank you.
Great. Hi, I'm John. He, him, his are my pronouns. My access is actually my glasses. I literally cannot see a thing without them. So if I would lose them, or if the lights aren't right, maybe that's age, maybe that's what, but it's literally a sight issue for me. So that would, I think that's about all on that.
Thanks, John.
I'm Karen Johnston,
and I'm a multiple pronoun-y person. And yeah, I can't see without my glasses. I also have post-traumatic stress syndrome, and so very loud noises, I can jump 3 feet and sometimes have to leave the room.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amelia Cheever. She, her, hers are my pronouns. And I guess I would say for myself, it would be, I'm like Pam, if it gets too cold, I really have a hard time dealing with that. So I'm in multiple layers today because it is so cold.
Hi, I'm Jean. I'm she, her, hers. I appreciate speaking up about the temperature because that very much is true for me as well. And I guess I have multiple physical injuries that I can't sit for long periods of time without being in pain. And I am very appreciative of these padded chairs because I can't sit on hard surfaces either.
Hi, I'm Cindy Peterson, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I think I'm starting to get a little bit older, as we all are, I think. And I have a hard time hearing clearly when I'm watching videos or movies. And so I almost have to have the subtitles on to be able to follow along and hear everything.
Hi, I'm Laura. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. In terms of access, I'm actually starting to need readers and finding that I'm not in the habit of carrying them with me, so I'll get to a restaurant and can't actually read the menu anymore, so I'm trying to get in the habit of that. I also have Raynaud's, which makes my fingers and hands and toes turn white and get very painful in severe temperature. So particularly if I go running outside and don't get warm right away,
Hi, I'm Deborah Pembleton. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I also have to have readers and I have them in every room, in every pocket. I don't need them to see normally, but if I'm reading any type of text, I most definitely need them.
Hi, I'm Hassan Hussein. I also have issues with sight and hearing. I believe I also have early dyslexia. Sometimes I struggle to find the letters, so it affects my access.
Hi, I'm Christy Siver, she, her, hers. And I really appreciate having a table and a separate desk because it doesn't make me self-conscious of how my body is fitting in a desk. So, and it also allows me to adjust for all the aches and pains of life.
I'm Ken. He, him, his site, obviously, for all old people, right? And I really appreciated Davey's thing about getting up and stretching. I get tired of being in the same place, and I need to move.
Hi, I'm Karen, and I'm interested in the pronoun question. It's not easy to answer, so if you would just say Karen, that would be great. I'm not feeling the need for pronouns, actually, and wanting to move beyond binary. So even saying one or the other makes me feel like I'm not speaking truth. And I suffer from migraine, so I have to watch lights. I also have the Raynaud's, and so cold is a trouble.
Hi, I'm David, most often, he, him, his. I enjoy performing on stage without my glasses, but if there's any kind of text involved that I have to read, I need my bifocals. And I really love name tags because I kind of recognize everyone's spirit and soul and just feel bad if I don't remember their name attached to it as well.
Hi, I'm Carol, and I don't know what I'm supposed to say next because I came in late. Access needs. Oh, thank you. And she, her, hers. Yes, so I'm also similar to several of you. I have.
Could you speak a little bit more into the mic?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
So the being able to see, I have bifocal progressive thingies so that I can read, but they don't always move clearly. I also have 2 kids with sensory issues, and that has led me to realize that I also probably have some sensory issues. For instance, I used to teach in an auditorium, And at the end of class, when the students would all come rushing at me, it was all I could do to not run out the emergency door. and so I have, some issues around crowds and people, too many people too close to me or too loud or too much noise, too much light. So quiet, dark spaces like art history classrooms are great for me.
Thank you.
Camera's moving. All right. Thank you everyone so much for sharing.
We've got one left, Jay. We've got one left on the far other side. Oh, sorry. That's a good idea.
I'll swing over here. Hi, I'm Shane. He, him, his, and well, now I feel like I'm in the center of the room. I'm a migraine sufferer, so the light sensitivity is something that I need to watch out for. I also am one of the fellow Raynaud's sufferers in the room, so cold weather does me in. And I am increasingly completely dependent on having readers or progressive lens available. I was telling my partner I couldn't, I've been unable to shop several times when I couldn't read ingredients or directions on something. So.
Thank you. Did we get everyone? Yes, now we did. Okay.
So Davey, I think it's kind of on you if there's any accessibility needs in the space that need to be met
true.
around light or temperature. I can't do much from here.
Yes, that's true. So I don't believe we actually have a thermostat, but I'm very glad to see that everybody has got shawls. And if you want to be wearing gloves and taking your shoes off and putting shawls around your feet and whatever is going to help you with the temperature, I encourage you to do that. I think the norms of professional space that tell us not to do those things are not really designed for people with bodies. And so bringing our bodies really into the room and meeting our bodies' needs is a way to create greater access for everybody. As far as the lights, anyone who wants to be further from fluorescence is welcome to hang out with me on the dark side of the room. And I think we may even be able to shift the dark side a little bit if we need to. And one thing that we can keep in mind, and possibly even solve right now if it's helpful, is to get some other lights in here, like to borrow some floor lamps or clip-on lamps or something from somebody's office so that we're not relying only on fluorescent lights. So if that would be helpful for anybody, I'm glad to try to make that happen.
As long as it's not strobe lights.
Okay.
No disco.
So we'll definitely not flash any lights. Yeah, I am. Yes, me too. Thank you. Yeah. Great. Jay, do you want to talk about the more like framework around how we understand universal access?
Sure. So often the ways in which we start talking about accessible spaces as though they are either accessible or not, and that they are accessible for everyone, and that there's some sort of kind of universal norm that we should be stretching for in order to reach universal accessible space. The reality is that no space will be universally accessible for all people. Some people have need for low light, which would be a problem for many folks who have low vision. Some folks will need amplified sound, which will be a problem for folks who have sensory overload. And then in the ways in which we kind of start to create more accessible spaces, right? This is always kind of a harm reduction framing in a lot of ways, right? Trying to do the best that we can for the folks in the space and also trying to anticipate who may enter the space. We do make choices about who we prioritize and who we do not prioritize. So when I say accessible space, what are the things that kind of jump to mind for folks immediately?
Wide doorways?
Yeah, okay. So kind of built environment, physical change around a wide doorway. What else?
Padded chairs?
Did you catch that, Jay?
No, I did not.
Padded chairs?
Thank you. Right, so having seating that is comfortable for more bodies.
Related to that comfort, chairs that are large enough for all bodies. I
Mhm.
had challenges with that in my classroom.
Yeah. So making sure that spaces are actually kind of physically the correct size for more people with bodies. I sometimes look at chair sizes and wonder who they were made for. Definitely not me. So I'm hearing a lot of things around physical access, like body movement. What else?
Especially for our students, chairs or tables that work for right or left-handed people.
Yeah. So flexible design in the ways that desks or tables are set up. Absolutely. And so in the ways that we're just kind of naming, right off the top of our heads, it's all about mobility, right? And so when we start thinking about other needs around sensories, around low light, around fragrance, these are things that are often not chosen. And in fact, people will often fight about whether or not these are real rather than something that is more visible or can be more directly traced into the body. And so in the ways that we decide how a space is set up, we are actively choosing who can and cannot access that space. Again, there's no perfect one right way to do this. And it's really important to kind of interrogate and look at who we're thinking of and who we're not thinking of.
Mhm. And it's messy. I have a feeling we might have been about to say the same thing, so you go ahead.
Probably. And it's messy. And it gets very complicated. Davey, what else would you like to add to that?
It's reminding me a little bit of a quotation from a disability justice writer named Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarsinghe, who talks about, like, how do you know you're doing disability justice? And I'm paraphrasing, but she says, you know you're doing it when everything starts 2 hours late and you're like scrambling to make sure that everyone's vans show up when they're supposed to, and you have to go get new batteries for the microphone, and it is that messy. And I did a weekend seminar about disability justice a few weeks ago, in which the first thing that happened was one person said, well, I have an access need that you just can't meet because both low light and high light are really troublesome for me. Like, I get migraines, but also I can't see well. So there's not gonna be anything we can do about it in this room. And my co-facilitator pulled out a bunch of clip-on lamps from her gigantic tote bag, and we clipped them onto the desks so there was high light on the desk and low light up here. And actually several people just started crying because it had never occurred to them that an access need that's complicated could be met. But actually with a little creativity, you can make it work, right? You can have people who need high light and people who need low light in the same room and have it work with some preparation, some creativity, and some willingness to spend time on it, even if that means that you start late.
I have earplugs that I carry with me.
Earplugs, yeah, it's a great example. Mm-hmm. I guess I would add one example folks haven't said, that one way that we can make space accessible is with social norms, with guidelines about, like, asking before you touch someone because of trauma and because of sensory stuff, right? Guidelines about someone to repeat themselves or slow down. The sort of norms about how we interact with each other's needs are also a way of making spaces accessible.
Could I ask, would it be in that same universe to say allowing time for check-in to see how people are doing?
Yeah.
Which I seldom do once I get going.
Yeah, I think that is a part of making spaces accessible for sure.
I was just going to say one, so my little bladder again, but sometimes I'm told, well, then you can just leave. We'll just keep going, but you're allowed to leave and go. And then I'm like, but I don't want to miss it. So then I'm just in agony, hoping there'll be a break. And so that's something that I really appreciate, is if there can just be little breaks, then everyone can be a part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Jay, are you ready to move into the next piece? Oh, now we can't hear you. I think that's a yes. Everything froze. Oh no. We can see you moving now and not hear you yet. So while Jay is getting reconnected, I'm going to transition us to the next piece, which is, first of all, meeting access needs is never over, right? So if something else comes up, feel free to bring this back and ask for what you need, and I'll try to make it happen. With that, we wanted to spend a little time with you all talking about any observations that you might have had over the Thanksgiving break. So I'm going to invite you to get into small groups, groups of 2 or 3 people, and think about one thing we didn't ask you to notice, but maybe you can notice in retrospect, is what did the access look like in any holiday events that you were at? What bodies would have been able to access that space and what bodies wouldn't? And by bodies, we mean that pretty broadly to include minds also. And then what did you notice about how food and bodies are talked about? How does that make you feel? What does it make you think? And did you try to intervene in any way? And if so, how'd that go? And I'll also write that on a board so that you don't have to have them memorized. So go ahead and get into some small groups and start with what did access look like in those spaces? Let me check in with everyone about time. How are you doing with the holiday discussion questions? Would you like some more time with your group? A little more time, a lot more time? I think folks are saying they're done. Cool, awesome. And Jay is back with us, so he didn't have to miss much. Yay, welcome back. So actually what we're going to ask you to do with that is not report out anything from those discussions, but first we're going to put some frameworks to it and then talk about it in those frameworks. And Jay, I'm going to get the slides up for you over here.
Great.
And they should be shared with everybody in about 2 seconds. Okay. Jay, are you seeing that on your screen as well as in the camera?
Yeah.
Rad. So just tell me when you want me to turn a page.
Okay, so I just need to, I think we're just on the front page right now, so I just need one forward. Or I can only vaguely see it on the camera, actually. Give me just a second here.
Yeah, so we're on the first
We're on the first gear.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, camera person, for moving me closer. All right, so we wanted to talk a little bit about, as Davey said, a framework of oppression. So this should look familiar to some folks. This is kind of a reintroduction. So as a reminder, when we're thinking about oppression, we're thinking about a system that operates through a variety of mechanisms. So this isn't just driven by one thing. This isn't just kind of a simple piece or a one-part system or a spectrum of things that we're looking at. We're looking at multiple mechanisms that continue to maintain this. And so the ones that we are kind of framing out here are individual behaviors, which is probably the easiest to understand. So what are you doing, saying? This may also show up in attitudes, bias, beliefs. The structures and policies that are also part of this system. So this could be at institutional policies, when we're thinking about individual institutions, a specific school, a specific workplace. This also can be things like law and policy at a variety of levels. And then kind of the big purple gear at the bottom right there, purpley blue, is widely held beliefs and norms. So this is also interacting with and driving all of these. So no one of these is separate from each other. They are all driving each other. They are all driven by each other, because this is kind of how a system of gears works. And we are going to talk through a few examples about how this shows up when we start thinking about disability justice and when we start talking about fat justice and liberation, both interacting and then also a little bit more independently to just kind of try to tease some of this out. We also just want to emphasize that the examples that we came up with are not in response to any specific thing that has happened where y'all are working. These are common patterns across organizations and institutions and individuals. And the thing that really keeps these gears moving, keeps the system going, is relationships, right? So individual behavior, widely held beliefs and norms, structures and policies, the way that these really get built on each other and continue to keep going is through relationships. These are the grease, so to speak, for these gears. So a widely held belief doesn't just appear in your head. It isn't just something that you suddenly have. It is something that you specifically learn because of a direct or indirect relationship, and that may have been a direct or indirect relationship with family, with an institution, with media, with friends, with other pieces in your life, role models, possibility models. These are all kind of places where these do come in. Also, just as a side note, right, the individual behavior, you'll see on here, there's nothing about intention. There's nothing about whether or not you're trying to do something that is oppressive. This is about the impact of that, and also those behaviors continue to drive. So the system is driving us, and we are also driving the systems in the choices of what we say and we do, and how we structure our lives and make choices within our workplaces, within our personal lives, within our classrooms. In some ways, oppressive behavior, so anti-fat behavior and belief, anti-disability or ableist belief and action is almost inevitable because of the way that these gears line up, until you start to potentially see what's happening and can disrupt it. So, for example, if we start thinking about treating everyone the same, right, so we're going for equality, we're going to treat everyone the same, we're not actually meeting anybody's accessibility needs because we don't even know what they are. We're not creating chairs for all bodies. We're thinking about a standard body. Is this landing for folks?
I see lots of nods.
Yes.
Great. So, Davey, would you like to move into the first example?
Sure. So I believe I've introduced this a few times, and I don't think we've actually practiced with it. So one of the ways that we can apply this model is to sort of plug in a specific example and then see what's going on in each of those gears that helps explain that example. So here's an example of a moment that might occur. You host an end of semester party at your house. Your house has steps leading up to both of the outside doors, and one of your colleagues can't walk up steps. So how do we break down what's going on there? The individual behavior is the easiest thing to see. People don't think about access needs if they're not in the habit of thinking about them, right? Or we might be in the habit of thinking about our own access needs and the needs of those closest to us, but maybe not the access needs in our broader community. And people tend to assume that most people can do anything that they can do physically. So if I can lift 10 pounds of groceries, I assume most people can. That's connected to some stuff in the purple gear of the widely held beliefs and norms. And there, I mean, we could write a whole dissertation about this purple gear, right? But just for a few examples, there's this widely held belief that a normal body is one that is free of injury, illness, or aging, that disabled bodies are a burden on others, that they create extra work, and that people who work in a job, especially in a professional job, are not disabled. That when we think about disability access, actually the disability access practices in places like human service agencies are often like way more thought through than in places like professional offices, because there's this assumption that disability lives in the not working population. And this is connected to all kinds of structures and policies. Some simple ones to start with. Stairs are standard in new home construction. Who decided that? Why is that a good plan of how to build a house? And disabilities legally are categorized by impact on ability to work. So in terms of your access to government subsidized supports for disability services, for in-home care attendants, for durable medical equipment like wheelchairs, all of this, your access to any kind of subsidies for those is prioritized based on how much your disability impacts your ability to do a wage labor job. So disability is defined in large part by capitalism, actually. Jay, anything you would add to this example?
No, that was great.
Any reactions, questions from the group? Who has a microphone to pass?
Just to add to the stairs, railings to hang on to.
Yeah. On, it is on. You ready for another example? Great. Jay?
All right. So a student who we are going to name Amy shares in class that she was just catcalled by some male students on her way to class. Another student is surprised. She gets harassed that way, but she didn't think that Amy would because Amy is fat. All right, so obviously we're looking at something that is anti-fat oppression in this case. So again, to kind of start with the individual behavior, we have this reality that peers and service providers regularly disbelieve fat people about experiences of violence. And this goes from, what is happening in this very specific example, so it's kind of peer-to-peer, also professor to student, also medical doctor to patient, also therapist to client. This is a very common experience. We also may have this piece that is also going on that peers may encourage fat friends to settle for not great relationships because that's the best they're going to get. I put heavy air quotes around that last piece. I'm gonna move into the structures and policies again. So some of the things that may be going on here is that because of some of the widely held beliefs and norms that we're going to talk about in a second, stylish clothing is not widely available in fat sizes. We also talk about straight sizing up to a certain point, and then there's plus sizes. And once you get beyond an 18 or a 20, the likelihood of actually finding clothing that is stylish and up to date is fairly low. And we may also be looking at significant more cost for that clothing. Also, institutional responses to harassment tend to depend on an assessment of the victim's perceived deservingness, which could be worthiness, attractiveness,
Believability.
Assumed morality. All of those pieces are influenced then, right, by these widely held beliefs and norms, which again, this is another dissertation that I'm sure someone has written several times over. So a few pieces here, fat bodies are undesirable, which then becomes the thing that gets activated here because there's also the idea that harassment, sexual assault is about desire and sexual desire rather than power. And there's also this idea that fat bodies should be hidden and covered. So these are all going to kind of influence the individual behaviors that are taken and then the structures and policies that are in place. Davey, is there anything you'd like to add to this one?
One of the things I love about the GEARS framework is that every time we talk through an example, I think of even more examples that could go in each bubble. And this thing about fat bodies should be hidden and covered, one of the policy ways that that comes out is, for example, on Instagram, very often a picture of a naked fat body, even if there's like no genitals or nipples showing, gets censored in a way that a thin body, that same picture would not get censored. But fat rolls are somehow obscene, whereas like a naked midriff of a thin person isn't.
Right. Right. And I think one very prescient example, although I'm not sure how many folks in the room maybe saw this, was Lizzo at the Lakers game.
Uh-huh.
Lots
of nods,
right?
yes.
So where she wore a t-shirt dress with the butt cut out, and then a thong and fishnets underneath that, and twerked along to her music while the cheerleaders were dancing. And we know that there's been examples of thin folks who have displayed much more in public who have not been censored and gotten the kind of negative response that she has. Because again, fat bodies should be covered, should be seen, should not be sexy, should not be stylish, and should be hidden away because there's something additionally obscene or inappropriate about them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. Any responses to this one? Any additional thoughts?
Yes.
Something my mother always said was, isn't it wonderful that there's someone, no matter what they're like, that there's someone else who will desire them? Unfortunately, our society does not support that. So it's not only the person that's fat that has the problem, but it's people who, who get treated as if they have a problem. But it's also people who might actually be very attracted, but they're going to get shamed for feeling that way.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you bringing the reality of kind of dating and relationships into this, although obviously we are, in this example, I just want to be very clear about, harassment and desirability obviously are not the same thing, and harassment is about power, not about desirability. When we start though looking at dating patterns and preferences, preferences are just as informed by these widely held beliefs, these structures and policies, and frankly the context of individual behaviors that are happening. So which peer group are you in? How will this be responded to? What will happen if you have a fat partner?
Mm-hmm.
If you express an attraction to a fat person? And we can see this playing out in very similar ways, because again, these systems are not that creative, they just are very powerful, with anybody that is considered non-standard when we start thinking about white, cisgender, heterosexual, thin, abled person as standard.
Mm-hmm. So let's move into one further example.
Great.
And this one brings together many of these pieces, and the example, this one is true and is pretty upsetting. So this is a real thing that happened. On October 29th, 1984, Eleanor Bumpers, a 270-pound, arthritic, 67-year-old black woman, was shot to death by police while resisting eviction from her apartment. She was 1 month behind in rent, and she wielded a butter knife. So there's something kind of unfathomable about why, 5 armed deputies would find it necessary to use lethal force on someone who is armed with a totally harmless object and also quite physically disabled. And so on an individual level, what we know is that the officers felt entitled to use deadly force, and they probably would say they felt afraid, or they felt that they were in danger, and so it was necessary. Structurally, we know that there's broad permission for police use of violence and of deadly force, particularly against black folks. Structurally, also, property rights are often valued over human rights, and certainly in this case. The article I learned this from, by the way, stated the exact amount of rent because it was a rent-controlled apartment, which is a whole other piece of structure. The 1 month of rent she was behind on was $98. Yeah, she was killed over $98. Yeah. And so this only begins to sort of make sense when we look at the widely held beliefs and norms that are used to excuse and justify those policies as well as those behaviors. So there's a widely held assumption, not often stated, but implied, that fat black folks are dangerous, particularly big black men, but in this case also a big black woman. And that gets communicated often through metaphors with animals, or through talking about being out of control, right? There's also a widely held assumption that disabled lives are not worth living. And so it may feel easier to use violence or to dismiss or to not do life-saving healthcare when somebody feels like, oh, well, if I was in that body, that would be so awful, right? There's a sort of projected, that must be a life that's not worth living. And there's a widely held belief that fat black bodies, and bodies in general, and especially black bodies, and especially fat bodies, must be under control at all costs. And this control comes up in terms of how we're expected to carry our bodies, clothing that's meant to make our bodies look a different shape than they are, right? But also control in terms of obedience to authority, control over sort of staying in your lane. And so we see here certainly anti-fatness and anti-disability stuff, and also racism, and also I'd say sexism, and also I'd say ageism, also classism. There's like a lot going on here, right? And each piece of it supports each other piece.
Right, because no one of these systems is ever operating independently of any others. They all are built together, and in many ways built on top of white supremacy and anti-blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move to our visual effect?
Sure. We have a comment first.
One just comment is...
No, you need the microphone.
Can we have a microphone, please?
Sure. I'm super loud anyway. I just have a comment on, that the lady was killed over $99. It doesn't matter whatever the amount is, even 99 million, it's a life at the end of the day. So the amount doesn't make any sense for me.
Yep. Yeah, thank you for that. So we started getting creative with the gears. So if we were to say these 3 gears are a system of oppression, in this case ableism, so we have the structures and policies related to disability, widely held beliefs and norms related to disability, individual behaviors related to disability, and they connect to some more gears, to some structures and policies that are about fatness and disability, to some widely held beliefs about fatness, to some individual behaviors about fatness and race. And those connect to some widely held beliefs about race and some individual behaviors about race and some structures and policies about race. And if I was able to do 3-dimensional smart art, we could go even further. Is this feeling like a useful visual for folks? I see lots of nodding.
So maybe if we could walk through with a concrete example, Davey.
Yeah, great.
Great. So thinking about the ways in which conversation and rhetoric, so widely held beliefs and norms around Black people and people of color more broadly, and often specifically Black people, might turn the wheel of structures and policies around who is able to access and what the mean testing is set up to be for safety net benefits, which then might turn into rhetoric around the deserving and undeserving disabled, the worthy and unworthy disabled, the real disabled versus those fraudulent people trying to work the system, which then could turn into individual beliefs about whether or not someone's disability is actually real. And then that shows up in behaviors of if someone needs a wheelchair and also sometimes walks, questioning, threatening, taking away the wheelchair, trying to report that person so that they don't have their benefits anymore.
And also sometimes on an individual level, perhaps shaming that person for choosing to use a wheelchair sometimes rather than exhausting themselves by walking to and from class at the expense of having any energy left over after that. So could we see, we're gonna have a transparent facilitator moment because there's no way that we can talk without all of you hearing us. So I'm thinking we should go through one example from, or some examples from a holiday gathering and then take a break there because I think that we may not have time to do the piece after that. How does that sound to you?
I feel like that's a really good place to make this happen.
Great. So, thinking about any of the moments that you all observed over the holiday break, moments about food and bodies and fatness, moments about disability, maybe moments that were about those things and more. How can you sort of chart one of those examples onto a set of gears? Not necessarily all 9 gears, but like onto a set of just 3. How about an easier question? What did you observe happening in terms of individual behavior around fatness and/or disability? And then we can walk it through the other gears together.
My mother, as you know, my mother has suffers from cognitive decline and is in a wheelchair. Has very limited access to a lot of things, but she's still her same personality. She just can't follow a conversation. So sometimes people will say it doesn't make any sense to go see her because she'll just forget. And I'm wondering if there's something about age and ability to have a conversation that would be recognized by everyone else as a conversation. I don't know that that would fit here, but
absolutely.
Because as an advocate for her, continuing to have a fun life, I keep going, trying to say, well, how could things be fun? And we have a ton of fun.
Right.
So I don't know what to say when people are saying, well, but she doesn't even know 10 minutes later. Yeah, that's probably true too, but for the minutes we were having fun, I think it was really laughing, and laughing is good.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that really fits your idea, but.
Absolutely. So if the individual behavior is, first of all, saying like maybe it's not worth visiting, she won't remember 10 minutes later, and also acting on that and not visiting her. What are some widely held beliefs and norms about disability or about aging or perhaps about other things that might inform those individual behaviors?
Perhaps a widely held belief is for an interaction to be meaningful, one has to be recognized and identified in the way that they want to be.
Interesting.
I think also in terms of what I know about certain kinds of schooling, their ideas about people with cognitive limitations maybe shouldn't be in school or can't learn. Yeah, so they don't get the same attention that students who are neurotypical would.
Yeah, so that's an institutional or structural piece related to that same set of assumptions about what makes a meaningful interaction or who is worth interacting with.
It seems like there's also an assumption that if you go visit an older person, it's just for them. Like, it's some sort of duty, and it's not going to be fun, and it's like this burden. And so, like, if they're not even going to remember, then you aren't going to get credit for your suffering, so why do it? I mean, that seems to be kind of the...
Yeah. So a lot of pieces coming up there, right, around the value of elders, around the value of people with cognitive disabilities or disabilities more broadly, around that people are burdens, or that your discomfort temporarily is more important than maintaining a relationship, and that this is an exchange-based economy.
And that there's a like certain kind of self-awareness or like a continual consciousness of oneself as a cohesive self is assumed to be necessary for anything to be worth it, for life to be worth living. Which also makes me curious how that particular piece of ableism may also relate to humans' interactions with non-humans. Or even with cultures that are more collective and don't put as much stock in a continuous sense of an individual self. So I'm seeing very, very thoughtful expressions and also maybe tired ones. And I want to ask if my interpretation is accurate, that you are very thoughtful and pensive about the example and also maybe a little bit, your brain's full and you need a break. A lot of people are nodding, so I think both of those are accurate. So let's take a break and let's come back at 1:15. Please feel free to bring snacks and whatnot back to your seats. We're going to get started in just a moment. Jay, are you hearing me again? Okay, yeah, great. And
I am, I was just on mute.
great. I'm going to hang out over here so I can control the laptop without dropping the clicker. And folks are mostly back, and you can get started whenever you want.
So just to bring us back into the room a little bit after break, we were hoping to do kind of a little warm up, get brains moving again. So just take a minute to reflect on, in the past 24 hours, what are the things that you've used that have made your life easier? So, David, do you want us to just go through these individually, or do you want to put them all up?
We can put them all up at once.
All right, let's put them all up. So think about tools you've used, aspects of the built environment, policies or laws, institution, community, city where you live, federal, whatever that looks like, and social norms. So we have a couple of examples up here. So just kind of take about a minute to think about your last day. So since about 6:45 last night to now, what have you used that's made your life easier? And then we will bring the mic in and get some feedback.
Turns out I wrote these examples for students. So when it says an example is queue up for breakfast, I was thinking of like dining hall breakfast, not in your own home kitchen, I assume.
I mean, that could be someone's social norm. Depends on what size kitchen you have, I suppose.
Yes.
And if
And
you're
what size
actually
family,
cooking
right?
in the morning, which anybody who is, kudos to you. So let's get a couple of answers for each of these. So what are some examples of tools that you've used in the last 24 hours that has made your life easier?
I use
Glasses.
jumper cables.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm sorry for the need to use jumper cables, and yes, absolutely. What else?
A coat?
Gas fireplace.
Gas fireplace, a coat.
An ice scraper? Someone said glasses earlier.
Coffee maker.
A coffee maker. Also coffee itself.
Toothbrush.
A toothbrush.
Crock pot.
A crock pot. Audiobooks, cool.
All right. What about some aspects of the built environment around you?
Roads, stairs.
Roads, stairs.
My special office chair that I bought to prevent from continuing to hurt my injured back.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Trackball on my computer.
The trackball, uh-huh.
What about, so this is a little bit more abstract, so thinking about kind of policies or laws.
Speed limit.
The speed limit.
I'm guessing from some giggling that maybe people have not observed that perhaps as closely.
There's no speed limit in North Dakota? Oh.
There's nobody there.
Any other policies or laws? What about institutional policies that have made your life easier?
Well, it's doing well, the semester structure.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. What about, Jay, this is just occurring to me now, but aren't there policies and laws around the municipal water supply and keeping it safe? That probably made my day easier.
There are so many public health laws that we do not think about. Has anyone drank milk today? Eaten any food that was processed somewhere? Drank anything that was processed somewhere? All of the laws around safety for food and beverage would be big ones. No one's pooping on the street, generally speaking.
Not here.
This has potentially options, hopefully, depending on how accessible public restrooms are there. Having public restrooms at all.
My garbage was collected this morning.
Yeah.
Public school. That made my day easier this morning. Because my partner was out of town and doesn't get home until like 2 p.m. and I had to leave home at like 8 a.m. And knowing that the teenager was in a supervised environment during those hours made my day easier.
Definitely. What about social norms?
Students held the door open for me.
Did you hear that, Jay?
No, I did not.
I was too far away.
2 students held the door open for me. I think that's a social norm.
John, did they add sir to that?
I think they just said old guy move, I think.
Any others?
I would say expressions of gratitude. I made one to colleagues and received one from a student, and I thought, well, that's a social norm that
Yeah.
helps.
Yeah.
Something that's happening right now that I appreciate is folks taking turns.
Right.
I think we have a pretty serious snow removal culture, removing snow from around your neighbors' mailboxes, driving slowly when it's icy out, putting salt out if there's not salt there. I think we've got a pretty strong culture around snow and avoiding or being careful in it.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of this from the room. So why might we be asking you about things that have made your life easier in the last 24 hours? On a day when we're talking about disability and fat justice.
Because those are probably things, those might be things that aren't happening for other people.
Okay, so maybe it'd be a differential impact because of the ways that these systems operate. What else?
There,
Someone said what we take for granted.
the way we modify the environment to make lives easier for ourselves.
Yeah.
That we had access to those things that were made for us, right?
Yeah. Other ideas?
I'm going to play off of Deborah's snow removal. We went to an appointment this morning, and another advantage, parking in a handicap spot for my wife. But I opened the door for her to get out and realized that there was snow and ice right there. It was fine for me. I could walk over without any problem, but she's not stable enough to put her foot down without worrying about sliding on it. So,
Yeah. Right. So all of these pieces kind of coming together, when we start thinking about things as for the public good or for public safety or for public access, those are often things that are universal accessibility measures, right? Having a sidewalk means that we are not generally dodging cars and potentially getting hit and have easier ways to get around. And it's often only when we start talking about or framing this in terms of accessibility for disabled bodies or for people with disabilities that there starts to be pushback, that there starts to be questions. And we don't often see all of the little ways that we are interdependent with each other and create accessibility at all of these individual, institutional, social, and cultural levels.
So one thing we sometimes talk about in terms of disability is an accommodation as opposed to an access. An accommodation is when you make an individual exception to accommodate somebody's need that's different than the presumed norm or different than the average need or whatever. An access feature is when you build it in the first place so that anybody who might need that, it will already be there. So for example, one of the schools that I sometimes teach at, when I was a student there a very long time ago, if you needed, there were those horrible desks, like the tiny ones with the wooden attached desk thing, right? They're horrible. They're not meant for humans. And there were like many right-handed ones and a couple of left-handed ones in any room. And if you needed any different chair, you had to get a doctor's note and register with Disability Services to get another chair in the classrooms where you were assigned to have class. And if one day your class met somewhere else, then like tough luck on you, right? And now they've changed that practice so that every classroom has, many of them still have the same old awful desks, but every classroom has one or two that are wider and softer and not attached to a desk. So that's an access move so that people don't have to out themselves as having a particular body need, that it'll just be there for people who need it. An even more accessible move would be to make all of the chairs that way. Can you pass the microphone, please?
I always think about, other accessibility away from physical accessibility. Quick story happened to me, and that shows how, we should accommodate other things. First time I came to US was late 90. I came to study, prepare for my master's at that time. So I went to Brandeis University in Massachusetts. And one summer course I was taking was economics. One of the questions I got was about the relationship between bagel and cream cheese, which is easy, so elasticity. So easy. The more you use bagel, the more you demand more cream cheese. At that time, the internet was not as, familiar as today's. So there is no internet. I did not know what does it mean, bagel. So I kept looking everywhere. I couldn't find it. I went to buy a dictionary. That was the second day for me in US. I got the dictionary. I paid a lot of money. I couldn't find it. I kept do everything I can do to solve that question, to hand the assignment next morning. I didn't find the word. What does bagel mean? I decided to call back home and call some friends. Hey guys, what does it mean, bagel? Like, what? Bagel? Describe it. I have no idea. So how it looks like? I have no idea. What do you use it for? I don't know. Maybe it's a plastic thing for snow. I don't know. That's why I'm calling. I really don't know. Probably call me half an hour. I would probably help. Half an hour? Did you get it? No. Okay, call the other friend. I called the other friend. And the other one, I made 3 different international calls. And that was my second day in US. I didn't get the word. I didn't get any answer. I spent a lot of money and time. And I handed the assignment without answer. And then the instructor said, oh, why you left that question unanswered? You answered all, other tough questions. I have no idea what that word means.
Yeah.
I kept looking for it everywhere. It's obvious for him at that time, but for me, I have no idea what that word means, bagel.
Right.
So it was not, for me, and I lost the point, but he gave me the point at the end of the day.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really good point, that the language we use is also part of accessibility in terms of how much are we assuming about people's background knowledge about mainstream US culture, and like what counts as mainstream enough that we're going to assume everybody has it and what doesn't. What do we assume about people's high school educations? All of that stuff.
As a quick language aside, I highly recommend plainlanguage.gov as a place to start kind of looking at de-jargoning your language, particularly making things clear for written documents that you will not be explaining.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Jay. So I want to transition us from this warm-up into the next piece by saying that part of the point of this warm-up is to show how disability is socially constructed, speaking of jargon. Because all of the tools we mentioned, for example, those are all access technologies. They're all ways that we accommodate our human limitations, right? But we don't call them access technologies once they're ubiquitous enough that everybody can just have one in their pocket. So if you use voice recognition to type with rather than your hands, everybody knows that that's a disability access technology, right? But actually the keyboard in the first place is an access technology. We're not writing everything out longhand, right? Let's see, what else? Clothing. I have been waffling. I also have Raynaud syndrome. I've been waffling for years about whether or not to buy one of those USB charger heated slippers to keep my feet warm during the day. That's a disability access technology, right? My feet don't keep themselves warm in a normal way, whatever normal means. But socks are also an access technology because we don't grow our own fur. So we need technology to protect us from the air.
I love the framing of clothing as prosthetic fur.
Totally, yes. And like caffeine as prosthetic awakeness, right? These are all access technologies. And when the tool that we need to make up for a particular limitation becomes ubiquitously available, that's often when that limitation stops being considered a disability. So for example, many people who need eyeglasses would have been basically blind in another historical period, right? But because glasses are pretty widely available, that's just like a manageable and normal limitation. So we're going to take a look at a social model of disability in more detail, but first we want to compare it against the unconscious model, the model of disability that most of us might be taught to assume just based on widely held beliefs and norms in the dominant culture. And that would be the medical model. So the medical model of disability says a disability is a physical or mental trait inherent to an individual person. You can see this is also a very individualist model in many ways. It's caused by individual abnormalities in physiology, anatomy, cognition, and so on. The medical system is the appropriate venue to address disability. And it assumes a norm that goes unexamined. And I want to pause us there and say, how might we describe that norm against which disability is compared? What is a normal body-mind? Yeah, oh, sorry, can you pass the mic?
That a normal body has access to all 5 senses, like unimpaired.
Yeah. Except how much? Could you,
Right, well,
I was with you until you said unimpaired, right? So how unimpaired do
Well,
they
I
have
just
to
meant
be?
that so it would be like a normal body has perfect vision, perfect, whatever that means.
Yeah.
Perfect ability to hear.
So what
touch.
defines perfect vision?
Yeah, I don't know. 20/20, I guess. I don't know.
Right.
I mean,
mine's actually better than 20/20 on this side.
Is it? Yeah.
So it's not perfect. Also, none of us can see infrared, so we don't have perfect vision.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. Like the
where's
normal
line?
does, but so the
Right.
access for the medical would be like, okay, you need glasses, so you're not.
Right. And somebody set the line at 20/20 and said, if you have less than 20/20 vision, then you need distance lenses. Right. When my vision got down to 20/20 in my left eye, I was like, I can't see the roadsides. And people were like, no one can see roadsides that far. What do you care, right? But someone had to set a threshold at some point. What else? What else do we know about normal body minds?
They don't need to see their feet to walk.
They don't need to see their feet to walk. They have proprioception. Okay, cool. Thank you for that vocabulary word. It's one of my favorites, proprioception. Knowing without having to look where your feet and hands are. An idea is hegemonic when you try to describe the norm and can't. I asked my students last summer, what is heterosexual dating culture? And they thought I was messing with them. And I was like, no, really, I don't understand it, explain it to me. And they couldn't, because it's hegemonic. It is so normalized that they don't realize there is anything to describe, right? And similarly, I think our ideas about what a normal body mind is are so normalized that we don't even know how to describe it. We can start to describe what it can do and what it can't do, maybe, which often has to do with thresholds that somebody had to set, right? A normal body can walk. How far can it walk? How fast can it walk? Not an infinite distance, certainly. I can walk a mile, but if I walk 2 miles, I would be hurting. Is that a disability, or is it only when you can't walk 5 miles that it's a disability, right? Where are those lines set?
I was going to say that we can sit here.
Can someone pass the microphone, please?
That we can sit here through a 2.5-hour workshop,
Absolutely.
right? And our minds are not bouncing all over the place. We can pay attention. We can stay awake.
Right.
We can pretty much people have sat the whole time, right?
Yeah.
But there are a lot of assumptions built into what we're doing tonight.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All of those things. We can retain a lot of this information. We can follow conversation at this pace. All of those are assumptions that might not be true of every mind body, but probably are true of many of them who end up in academia. Here.
this is going to sound counter to what we've just been saying, but I try not to take medicine because of having gone through chemo and all that, and just try to keep the chemicals out. And I've known that the medical profession, so even if we're saying, okay, medical aberration would be disability, I think it's comforting to the medical profession to think that they're maintaining the normal body through medicine. And so if they give you, okay, what's your list of medicines you're taking? I've learned to say vitamin B different from multivitamin so that they can check numerous things, because it seemed to be agitating to people, like, you can't not be taking medicine.
That's so interesting.
And so it's not that I don't take any medicine, but I'm just curious about this idea of, do we need to maintain the normal through medical means?
Yeah. So, I don't need that mic because I'm wearing one. Thank you. So there's a contradiction here where the medical model assumes a norm that the shortest way I've found to describe it is it assumes a body that is without injury, without illness, and to some extent without aging. Right, exactly. It describes no one, right? It's not a real thing. And I appreciate that you said perfect vision, even though we can't define what that is. But there is this conflation between normal and perfect, right? I think of that in terms of reproductive health care a lot, that there's an assumption that there's such a thing as a normal pregnancy, which is a perfect pregnancy. What's that, right? And a perfect pregnancy has never been normal. It's never been the case that 100% of pregnancies went perfectly. And at the same time, the medical system really needs people to have a lot of imperfections and needs to fidget with the body, right? So let's contrast this with a social model. A social model distinguishes between a disability and an impairment. So it follows the medical model insofar as an impairment is a physical or mental trait inherent to an individual. The social model still does assume that that is a thing, but it says disability is located in the interaction between an individual's impairment and the expectations of the built and social environment. So in other words, I have imperfect vision, but the expectations of the built and social environment only expect that I have actually a little bit worse than 20/20 to be totally fine in most situations. The social model is also a model of what to do about disability, right? So the medical model is a model of understanding disability that says what you do about it is you treat it with medicine, with the practice of medicine. Social model understands the nature of disability as the interaction between a human being's needs and limitations and the expectations of the built and social environment. How long are you expected to pay attention? How fast of a conversation are you expected to be able to follow, right? And what you should do about disability is, in the social model, primarily stuff around access and accommodation. And the purpose of access and accommodation are to enable individual independence. And when we say something socially constructed, I always like to say that disability is socially constructed is using passive voice. Who socially constructs it, or what socially constructs it? One of the things that socially constructs disability is the norms that dictate what sorts of access are available by default, including, for example, the norms about what temperature we set the thermostat to, which there's all kinds of research about how, on average, cisgender men are much more at ease in the temperatures that standard offices are set to than cisgender women are. There's something about hormone levels and body temperature. Possibly also about clothing, yes. Questions, comments, yes.
Just when you were talking about the social constructivism of this, thinking about the differences between eyeglasses and hearing aids.
Yeah.
That one is considered socially acceptable, the other generally
right.
isn't, and so I think that same thing, what's the impairment of the eyes that you use.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And I wonder how much of that has to do with the cost of the technology. And if there was such a thing as $39hearingaids.com, would those become more acceptable as glasses have? You know about
Earbuds.
$39glasses.com,
Yeah,
right?
I think we also associate hearing aids with getting older. Not
Yeah.
that everybody who has
Right.
hearing issues, that's it, and so it's stigmatized that way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's also the hearing aid corporations and the laws around hearing aids, because hearing aids cannot be sold as generics. They have to be controlled by audiologists. And so, yeah, so it would be completely possible to have $39.99 hearing aids. There's no reason technologically that couldn't happen. It's the way that the industry is constructed.
I am so offended right now.
Thank you, capitalism.
Right, and once again, capitalism constructing disability, right? Not only in terms of what are the expectations of jobs, right? Like someone is disabled in this country if they're too disabled to work a 40-hour week. Why is that the threshold? Maybe no one should be working 40 hours a week, right? So the social model takes us many steps towards liberation from the medical model, but also is not perfect. So we're gonna add in another model. And this is the disability justice model that some of you read about. I'll first read the sort of parallel version on the right. A disability justice model assumes that all bodies have both limitations and strengths, and that applies to minds as well. That both disability and impairment are constructed, and not only that, but they're constructed in large part by systems of categorization and power, like racism, sexism, heteronormativity, ageism, and so on. That what counts as a good enough body is deeply entangled with all those other systems. That access, radical, creative, universal access, even when it's expensive or inconvenient, is how you should address disability. That nobody is independent, not disabled folks and not anyone. That instead we look to support interdependence. And that we can value and celebrate all bodies, including bodies in pain. And this is a tricky one, and it comes out of the disability rights movement that sort of coincides with the social model, really comes out of some like white middle class men with mobility impairments organizing in Berkeley and then Chicago and then around the country in the 1960s. And one of the sort of, a piece of the rhetoric that they were really pushing was that we don't need to be cured, right? That rather than obsessing over cure, we should look for like access and accommodation so that we can participate and be independent. And while many disability activists across lots of different disabilities really embrace that idea that cure is deeply problematic and troublesome and that we need to really think hard about how we engage with the idea of cure, it is also true that some disabilities are inherently unpleasant. Like fatigue doesn't really get more pleasant even if I give myself space to be fatigued. Like I still don't like that feeling, right? Pain isn't less painful if I have accommodation for it or for how it affects my productivity, right? And at the same time, so we can seek cure for some aspects of disability. Some people can seek cure for aspects or all of their disability and still value and celebrate their body in the meanwhile. And that's a tension that disability justice as a social movement, but also as a cultural movement, as an artistic movement, really strives to hold that tension. On the left is a picture of Leroy Moore from his performance in a performance troupe called Sins Invalid that's based in San Francisco, and it's a queer, disabled, mostly people of color performance art group, and they are phenomenal, and their movie is out now. You can get it through some library systems. And their sort of disability justice manifesto says, all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies are whole. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We move together with no body left behind. I will send you the slides, so you don't have to write it down in order to have it later.
Can you send us the name of that movie?
What is the name of that movie? I think it's just called Sins Invalid. Yeah, and it is. It's the film is just documentation of their performance from one of their years. It's a different show every year. We're going to see a picture from it in a little bit. So that was a whole lot of concept around disability, how we frame disability, that's sort of moving us from the medical model through the social model, and then the social model is kind of like where a lot of contemporary academic studies are stuck right now. And disability justice is where we start to move beyond that in some ways. So now we're going to add in some pieces and go through the sort of parallel models around fatness.
And I would encourage y'all to kind of listen for and hold the similarities and differences between these two. So if we could move to the next slide. Awesome. So when we start to think again about this kind of medical model of fatness, it gets framed into a very similar model around disability, and this would be particularly called obesity or the obesity epidemic. Which, two really terrifying words thrown together to really drive home how bad fat bodies are here. So components of this that will probably resonate pretty strongly with most of you as far as kind of how this is framed. This is, again, the hegemonic framing. So fatness is a physical trait that is objectively measurable. And would anyone like to throw out the objective measurableness of fatness?
BMI.
Right, so the standard one that gets used is BMI, which I just want to pause for a moment there, and I will come back to because it needs to be complicated. A whole lot. And I will just say here before we move on, BMI is bullshit, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. So another component of this, fatness is caused by individual unhealthy behaviors, specifically around food and lack of movement. Then there is a medical diagnosis called obesity that is defined by a scientifically defined threshold of fatness, again, BMI, that is inherently unhealthy. So obesity gets framed as inherently unhealthy once you cross this mystical threshold. Also, obesity is a meaningful measurement of population health that can be targeted for intervention at individual and population levels. So it's not just framed as an individual health problem. This is one that gets pulled out to look at subpopulations, whole populations of a city, of a state, of a country. And again, this is assuming a norm that goes unexamined. So let's start there for a moment. What is the norm here that goes unexamined about bodies? What is the normal body?
I still remember that slogan for a while, if you can pinch more than an inch, right? Then you're overweight, right? So the normal body is one where you can pinch less than an inch.
And where? Where is this pinching happening? And on who? And is this consensual? And what are we pinching with? Okay, so what else? Thank you for that one.
This is just making me think, I was working with some counseling grad students this summer, and they were saying that when they did their patient intake, that if someone was fat, they would mark that as a presenting problem. And I said, is that because the person would say, I'm concerned about this? No, it was just we would look at the person and we would decide that they were fat, and that would get marked. And that was just, that was part of the standard intake at the hospital, which is a terrifying example of the medical model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's true in emergency departments as well, not just for mental health. No matter what you're there for, that is one of the presenting problems.
It will always get added to your chart.
I had a book for pioneer people in the 1880s for the Midwest or the Plains, and it said if you don't have 3 inches of fat on everyone in your family before it snows, they might not make it through the winter.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, right, history and context, as those shift, the way that we construct health and unhealth, fatness and thinness are also shifting.
Mm-hmm.
What else is this normal body?
It has to fit in the chairs.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to fit into a set built environment, set tools that you are able to use. So again, I'm kind of noticing, as with when we're talking about the norm around disability, like naming this is difficult, except in naming what it is not in some ways. So when we start thinking about the normal body, right, it's thin and way thinner than average, and also still healthy in every way. So no illness, no impairment, no injury, no aging.
And athletic too.
Yeah.
Not just able to walk a mile, right? Able to run 5 miles.
No, thank you. Right, and the ways in which we've just constructed fitness within the last, 40 years has shifted significantly from a slender frame to a slender athletic frame to a slender muscular athletic frame.
Yeah.
And it varies by gender and it varies by race and what this is supposed to look like. And we can definitely say what it's not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to circle back to BMI for just a second before we kind of move into the more kind of social model around fatness, or in some ways the harm reduction model that gets us a couple steps closer to liberation. So I know that we gave you the article kind of framing where BMI came from and how it is connected, so that this was developed as a measure of population size, not of health, that this was never supposed to be used at an individual level, and it has been. And the ways in which it has been continually used to frame and shame bodies has been a problem. And it's also just ridiculously obviously constructed. Who takes height squared and puts it under weight and decides that that is a thing that should ever happen? It's just a very strange measure. And also, there have been a number of times just in recent history, in about the last 20 years, where they've just shifted the norms. So for a while, normal was up to 26, and then they just decided to make it up to 25 because that was easier to remember. There was also a point at which, in the early aughts, where they made a shift of 5 points. So 30 used to be overweight, but just the very beginning of overweight. So kind of up to 29.9 was considered normal, and then they just took 5 points away. Why did they do this? That's a great question. This was primarily driven by pharmacy and capitalist medical research, and also because there was a desire to be able to categorize more bodies as problematic and needing treatment at the world level. So, it's just one of those things that unless you kind of look into it, you don't realize how ridiculously constructed it is, and it's just one of the most blatantly constructed measures that doesn't make sense. Any thoughts, responses to this kind of medical framing before we move on? Okay, all right. Yep. So then to kind of look at a more social model, which we are framing as kind of the fat positivity or health at every size model. So we start looking at this. This is, again, as many of these things are, it's kind of moving us forward, and it is also harm reduction pending liberation. So, to badly misstate what the Black Panther Party said. So fatness is a subjective judgment that categorizes body by size into acceptable and unacceptable sizes. And to add here, not just acceptable and unacceptable sizes, acceptable and unacceptable levels of athleticism, levels of muscle, shape of body. So even there is, if you have a certain shape of a fat body, that is considered more acceptable or less acceptable, depending on what that looks like. There's also this tenet that physical size is influenced by many factors, and this is not indicative of behavior or character. So when we start looking at body size, we start seeing variations primarily by zip code, and in some ways related also to genetics, not necessarily about what people are choosing to do with their bodies. And fatness continues to be read and portrayed as indicative of morality or immorality, deservingness or undeservingness. And so fat positivity and health at every size says that's ridiculous and we need to stop. Because fatness is inherently not good and not bad. It's just a descriptor for some bodies, and people can be healthy at any or every size. Excuse me. Fatness, however, becomes a problem to the extent that the social and built environment privileges thin bodies over fat bodies. And that can also mean levels of athleticism, levels of muscle development, shape of body for clothing, and not just kind of the size of chairs and tables, or how wide the sidewalk is. Or if the car that you're driving allows you to be both short and fat, and so have belly that you need to keep back from the steering wheel, but doesn't actually then give you enough to get to the pedals because your legs are short. And then social norms construct what counts as too fat by dictating what sorts of bodies social structures make room for. So again, the problem is not in the individual, the problem is in the responses to, the construction of, and the choices that are actively made to include or exclude certain bodies. And when we say about kind of the making room for, we don't just mean things like built environment or tools or simple kind of chairs. We're also talking about, are you actually able to find work where you are not shamed, excluded? Are you able to be included and made room for at school? Is there space for you in your family without experiencing shame, harm, derision, and exclusion because of what your body looks like? Davey, is there anything you would like to add here?
No, I think you covered it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thoughts from the room? Any responses to this?
I guess I want to say, in working with students who are like very ready to believe anything I say about any system of oppression, and then we get to this and they're like, but no, it's just unhealthy.
Right.
But no, that bias is okay, right? It's really deeply internalized. And I want to say, like, none of us deserve to be shamed for our bodies. And also, let's not shame ourselves for the shit we've internalized from the dominant culture. It's like deep and hard to get through, right?
Yeah. And as a fat person, I have swallowed a lot of this, and it still pops out in my reactions and my biases to things as I'm moving through the world. And I will also say that this continues to be reified and shown over and over in media, right? There's fat coding of evil characters, and fatness gets used as a demonstration of immorality, undeservingness, villainness regularly. I think that, if we want to think about one that probably most folks are familiar with Star Wars and Jabba the Hutt, right? This giant slug-like creature who gets framed as disgusting and also sexually inappropriate. So all this immorality stuff gets tied very close together in this character that you're supposed to be immediately disgusted by because of the size of his body. So, as we also said, right, this gets us a few steps closer and not to liberation or justice. So we do want to introduce another model, which is our fat justice model. So when we start thinking about this, I'm going to start on the right side of the slide in the green box. That a justice model frames fatness as not inherently good or bad. It just is. It is a descriptor. This is one of the reasons that many folks in fat justice movements, also in health at every size movements, and just kind of in general, have really started to embrace the word fat as a descriptor, so that we're not using all of these more kind of stigmatizing and also in some ways childish words to describe bodies and make it less harmful. Fluffy being one of my favorites, chubby, rotund. A lot of these tend to be infantilizing, as well as about trying to hide from just the reality that bodies are different sizes. The other part of this is that people can be healthy or unhealthy at any size, and more importantly, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how healthy or unhealthy a body is, because all bodies, all fat bodies, all thin bodies have value, and we should celebrate all bodies, including fat, unhealthy, disabled bodies. And I'm not saying disabled and unhealthy go together, listing all of these things together. The reality also, kind of in this model, is that fatness is constructed in large part by systems of categorization and power, just like disability, racism, sexism, heteronormativity about which bodies are more valuable, most normal. And in that construction, again, it's not just these beliefs that are floating out there, it's the way that we internalize them, it's the way that we pass them on to other people, it's the way we represent them, it's the way that we modify ourselves in order to try to fit into this norm that doesn't exist for anyone's body. Any human with a body is never going to hit that perfection of a norm. And we need to make space for all bodies because that supports liberation and access for everyone. Right? So this is part of radical, creative, universal accessibility and starting from that place. And it also is going to do things like, if we put fat aside and we start looking at what's going on with the body around pain, we may actually be able to get at more what's causing it instead of just being told to lose 10 pounds. Thoughts here, responses to this model?
So I'm going to be totally honest. I have a very hard time using the word fat as a descriptor because of all of this, that we've been talking about. I teach art history, and I will be talking about these Neolithic fertility figures in about a month that I usually refer to as voluptuous or curvy, and I'm wondering, how do you feel about those sorts of words?
So again, my question would just be here, less so about kind of what our feelings are about those specific words and more about what is it about those words that sanitizes those bodies in a way that makes you comfortable with them.
Mostly because I have sisters who are offended by the word fat, but that is how they are typically described, and so for me, I struggle with the word.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'll have to think about if those are more comforting.
Right? And this is messy, right? This is messy, just like disability justice is messy. Justice is messy. There's no one right word. There's no one right way. There's no way to stop harm from everybody. There's no right way to figure out how to navigate this. Sometimes this is about just naming, right? What are we seeing? In these figures of these fertility goddesses, what are we seeing? We're seeing large bellies, we're seeing pendulous breasts, we're seeing large shoulders, we're seeing large hips. Why are those things indicative, and why were those things valued at that time, and why are they not valued now? Could be another way to approach in naming what we're seeing. I'm sorry, I think I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I think I do, that's exactly what I do. And I have them follow up with an exercise where they talk about that body compared to a Barbie, and social construction and beauty.
Yeah, great. Yeah. And right, in some ways, fat is a word that is being reclaimed. And it's not going to be a word that is reclaimed by everyone, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I'll say as a thin person, when I am a solo teacher teaching about fat justice, it's super awkward for me to be using the word fat so much while like half the students in the room are like, yeah, reclaim it, and half of them are like, oh my God, you're calling me fat, right? It's a lot, and it requires some like delicacy and trust, and I don't do it on the first week and all of that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, transparent facilitation moment.
Yes.
Do we want to dive into that question, or do we want to move on from here?
Yeah, I have a different facilitation question, which is,
Okay, great.
I think we have time to do a sculpture or the other thing.
Okay. Are you feeling like the other framework is more important than the sculpture?
Can I just ask a question of the group?
Yes.
So I always wonder when I think about the gender studies program, but I think it's a question I have about our curriculum more broadly. How many of us actually talk about or teach disability studies as a part of what we teach? That's the general question. And then with fatness, that's with regard to disability in particular, that's been a question or a concern I've had about the gender studies program for a very long time. There's always such a long list of intersections we need to address. I feel like that falls off our list, but I don't know that for sure.
Yeah.
So I just wonder for the people here, is that part and parcel of what you do? Because I think it's important for us to know that about what we're teaching our students.
When I teach my FYS and we discuss hairspray, which has a lot of issues within it, but also some positive things, we do bring up Tracy's size and her mother's size, and we have conversations around that in my class. So that's one place where I'm actually able to talk about people's body size and body issues. But that would be the only thing.
Yeah, in my politics and political life class, I added a section on ableism, and so we looked at physical disabilities and physical structure, like designing cities to be sustainable, but we also looked at other aspects of ableism that have not come up as much tonight about neurotypicality, which I think became a really big issue for me because of a student that I had who is on the autism spectrum. And so that spurred me to learn a lot, and I just wanted other students to kind of understand that better. So I incorporate that as a part of the whole spectrum of things that fit into one's identity.
I teach it in Gender 101 and also in even Feminist and Theologies of Liberation, because there's a theologian who talks about kind of God being a paraplegic, and that's her image of God, and how all of the churches are built to exclude her. Because even the ramps to let her in are on the side or in the back of these churches, especially because church buildings are often old. And so she kind of even brings that into theology. So.
And I teach human resources, and so we talk a great deal about disability law and employment.
I just feel like I'd like to see us encouraging and reinforcing, how to get the, it's not required for CSD 1 or 2, right? But it's something we can include, and I'd like it to be on the radar.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that partly out loud because I want it to be more on my radar, but I want it to be more on the radar for gender studies. But I think, disability will affect probably all of us at some point in our lives, and it affects so many of our students right now, and it's just important.
Yeah.
One little way I'm trying to do that is we have the collaboration goals, in the new curriculum, and when I do group work in class and we talk about those, I use that as a time to talk about how when you're working in a group, you need to take into consideration that there may be different ways, different strengths, different ways of approaching this material, and that you need to talk through what your way is, but then listen, and try to. And then I talk a little bit through I have 2 kids who are not, neurotypical, and so I've been learning a lot about that. So I don't specifically do it like a disability unit, but I try to make it part of how I'm setting up some of the things I do in class. And I'm not very good at it yet, but I'm working on it.
Yeah. Actually, you made the perfect transition statement. Thank you. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So I really appreciate the question and the responses, and it's an important thing to think through. I think if the way that intersectionality has been inserted into gender studies in some places really is as a first we do this intersection, then we do this intersection, then we do this one, right? The story that we used as an example of Eleanor Bumpers is from an article that is all of the intersections at the same time, and I use it to talk about the concept of intersectionality, actually, about the concept of how these different systems enable each other in several specific life stories, including hers. And so I think also I think we need to have a both and, right? We need to be doing the disability intersection in a way that does not take away from other intersections, but that really honors how they are all messing up each other.
And if I could just say one thing before
Yes.
we move into the next. I also really appreciate the question kind of in naming a gap in this, and I also want to name, in asking the question and in the responses, half of what we're doing today was left out.
Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The very convenient transition statement was even when there's not a unit on disability, part of how we frame other things can be moving towards disability justice. And that's a piece of, we can zoom out and say what just happened and how can we use this in our teaching. Doing an access check-in, an accessibility check-in, no matter what the topic is, does so much to bring disability justice into the room and to make room for the students to bring in ideas about intersections as you go, because you've already set a tone of our bodies are real in this room, our bodies get to have needs. These are things that we can talk about in relation to all of the other stuff we're talking about. And so how you teach can be informed by disability justice and fat justice as much as what you teach. This is an activity that we're skipping. This is also a still shot from that same movie by Sins Invalid. This is Nomi Lamb performing with a bird's nest made out of every prosthetic leg that she's outgrown since childhood. And it's beautiful, and I really very highly recommend it. Since we don't have time to do this activity, I'm going to write it up as an activity description and send it as a further resource. Jay, do you want to jump into this one, or do you want me to?
Go for it.
So we've talked a few times before in here about trauma-informed lenses, trauma-informed systems, trauma-informed practices, and this version is adapted from SAMHSA's version. Their 6th principle is something like gender, culture, and historical issues. And I think that's euphemism, so I called it diversity, equity, inclusion, and power. And to me, that's really in the middle and not just one of a list, right? To me, doing that means doing all of these other pieces. So what I'd like you to do in our limited time left is spend 5 minutes talking with someone next to you about how might you use these 6 principles, or however many of them you get to, whichever 1 or 2 you get to bring disability justice and fat justice into your classroom.
Students are okay. There are a few that are very, it's hard.
take a minute or so to wrap up your conversation, and then we'll bring it back together. I'm going to flip back to the Nomi slide because I think it's more conducive for breathing.
I would agree.
So let's bring it back together for our last few minutes. Jay's going to lead a little debrief conversation.
So we'd just like to hear from a couple of folks about how will you implement some of this in your teaching, in your classroom, in your work life. So we could hear from 2 or 3 people with just some examples of how you would implement these ideas around disability and back justice into your work. I know we have mics floating.
I have a question before that one. Yeah, quick question on that regard. What happens when that clashes with the disability or the rehabilitation law? You know, revealing that, you know, the confidentiality of disabled people, that's illegal. So how we deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's not illegal to disclose your own disability. So like with anything that you might invite students to share about themselves personally, it's an invitation, it's not a requirement. They don't have to talk about their access needs allowed in the class if they don't want to, but they can. And I think that permission is important because sometimes the confidentiality requirement accidentally expands beyond what it's meant to do to actually discourage people from disclosing themselves, even when disclosing is helpful. So like I've had people say like, oh, well, we'll just say there's a fragrance-free request, but we'll not say it's for you. That's actually dangerous because if people know that it's for me, then they will be extra careful around me, and that's helpful, right? And if they don't know, then they'll think it's just a hypothetical thing.
Right. And to that point also, you know, in the framing around asking about access needs, you're not asking about diagnosis, you're not asking about condition, and you can even frame it out to say like, I want to make sure that this space is accessible for you so you can be fully engaged and comfortable in it physically and mentally. What would you need to do that without telling me or trying to justify the whys? Just tell me what you need. There was a question to stage
sure?
left.
No?
We've just been talking about a fragrance issue within a classroom that we both had a similar situation, but disclosure would not be possible in that situation. We were just talking about because of the event that precipitates the trigger, right? How would I say that? But we were just talking about it.
Yeah. So I had shared that I had a student last year who had told me about having been sexually assaulted and having had panic attacks, but made it sound like that was something in the past, which I should know better, right? Because you never know when they're going to happen. But there was a scent in the classroom that triggered a panic attack because it reminded her of her assailant. And so I had done enough that she was able to disclose to me that this was going on. So when she had the panic attack, I knew what was going on. And what I realized afterwards, what I think I should have done is when she disclosed that, said, let's take 5 minutes at some point, you know, just to check in. So if this happens, what do you want it to look like?
Yeah.
Because what she had said was, you know, continue with the class. She didn't want anybody, she didn't want attention drawn to herself. So she went out into the hallway having her panic attack. And so I'm listening to what she overtly expressed, right? I said, luckily I had a student with much better emotional intelligence than I have, right? Who after a couple of minutes said,
can I go out to be with her? And I'm like, yes, and that was, absolutely the right thing. But I kind of got halfway there in that I knew what was going on, but I really needed to have sat down and talked to her and say, okay, this isn't, I don't know what to do in such a situation, so what would be helpful for you if it happens, and hopefully it doesn't.
Yeah. And that is also an access thing. It is not possible to have universal access. It is not possible to eliminate every possible trauma trigger from your classroom, right? But it is possible to normalize that, like, sometimes people have panic attacks.
But then I had a similar situation with a student who had the same trigger, right, from a sexual assault, but she asked that I let the class know. She didn't want them to know what it was about, but to make sure the class could be sent free, right? So it's interesting, like, one disclosure how that works in those situations.
Yeah. Great. And the responses to this are really important, right? So there's some really good things that have been pulled out here. So taking the lead from the person who's affected, responding in a way that says, what do you need in this situation? Whether that's a fragrance-free classroom, if that's possible, which David and I both have a lot of experiences with people thinking things are fragrance-free. And also just being able to say, like, okay, so if this happens, how do we respond? And then I would also just want to name the interdependence that was demonstrated by that student, saying, I'm seeing this, and I want to make sure that this is also okay. And so being able to have and encourage people to check in, have positive relationships, these are all things that can be around access needs for folks. So we want to make sure to end on time, and it is rapidly approaching 8 o'clock.
Yeah, we can hear the church bells telling us.
What?
We can hear the church bells telling us what time it is.
Oh, now I hear them. So let's just take a couple of breaths together as a group, and then we will end. So get yourself comfortable, feet flat on the floor if that is comfortable for you. Kind of center yourself in such a way that your body is kind of sitting in a way that feels good for it. If you feel comfortable closing your eyes, please do. Or just kind of let your gaze soften so you're not particularly looking at anything. And then just pull your attention to your breath. And let's just take some slow, deep breaths in, as deep as is comfortable, and out when you need to. In, as deep as is comfortable, and out as you need to. And one more. In, as deep as is comfortable, and out when you're comfortable and need to. These kind of somatic grounding techniques can also be really useful in classrooms when people are activated or when you're having difficult conversations, to pull attention back, to start or to end. So thank you all so much for all of your work and energy and engagement today, and particularly with our in-person and remote facilitation.
Thank you for being here, Jay. As always, if anybody has follow-up thoughts or questions and wants to be in touch, I'm glad to be in touch. I think you all have my email address. If not, you will by the time I send you some follow-up resources. I'm going to pass around a sheet so you can write down your email address so I can send you the follow-up resources and also a survey, feedback survey.